escuchando. Vamos a tener
Will
presentaciones
we have presentations from many organizations? First of all, we will have a lecture by Global Law Action Network. This is an international network of legal of experts that they work in litigations on environmental damages, human rights, etc. And Sarah, our peer, with one of the lawyers of GLAN, she will be accompanied with two activists, one from Barbuda and another one from Belize. And the Barbuda case is a case which jurisprudence is quite interesting, and it would be interesting for you to listen to it. And so this session has to do listening to different jurisprudence experiences that could be really interesting for you, and then we will have a presentation by a corporate accountability lab. She will she will talk to you about what corporate accountability lab what they do, but they do litigation work or support. They I think she will also summarize, will give a summary on the decision of the Court of the United States on the Chiquita case. So if you are ready, with no further ado, let us begin with the presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. I'm here with John Mussington from the Barbuda Land Rights and Resources Committee, and he's going to start our session by explaining what's been happening in Barbuda and explaining the case there, the Barbuda airport case, and why he got involved and took that case. And then I'll join in after. So over to you, John.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, and greetings, everyone. As Sarah just explained, my name is Mussington, and Barbuda has a long history. We are of African descent, and so that particular way of doing things have always been open. So small island, population of 1,800, the dependence and connection to the land and resources with regards to our culture, our prominent. So in 2017, we had a hurricane, and that hurricane, unfortunately, was used by the central government administration as well as private investors as an opportunity to change our system of land ownership and to impose a policy of economic development which is based on real estate sales. What that meant is that our main challenge was that there was a move to change our communal land system to private ownership. What that would mean is that Barbudans' free access to land and the resources, that will no longer be possible. And with a situation like that, where Barbudans will no longer be able to afford to buy property for building homes and that sort of thing, that would essentially eliminate us as a people and as a separate culture in terms of our way of doing things. So once we realized that that is what was happening, there was a specific project which involved the building of an airport. And so finding out that that was being done and also understanding what should happen in terms of procedures, for example, environmental impact assessments and planning permits from our Development Control Authority. Having found out that these things were not in place, we decided to engage legal counsel in terms of making a legal challenge against what was going on. So the challenge was started, and it took us from 2018 up until 2023, last year, in fact, this year, 2024, for us to get a ruling out of our highest court, which is the Privy Council, which granted us the legal standing to be able to carry out that challenge. Because one of the things the central government administration did was to make a motion that we did not have challenging. The two of us who were bringing that case, Jackie Frank and myself, we did not have the legal standing to bring such a case. The implications in terms of that particular position the government took was that if we failed on that, it meant that ordinary persons who are affected by policies of government or administrations which would threaten their environment, those persons will no longer have the redress to get some sort of satisfaction. Also pertinent to our case was the Escazú Agreement, which our government had signed on to and ratified at the time. And that Escazú Agreement is all about recognizing a people's right to information, people's right to participation in the decision-making process in matters that are going to be affecting their environment. And so using that Escazú, we were able to proceed and win our case at the Apex Court, which means that it is now precedent throughout the jurisdiction of the Privy Council, as well as throughout Latin America and the Caribbean and the world internationally, as a test case which confirmed the right of ordinary people to get justice in matters concerning their environment and safety. So that was my whole involvement in the situation. Global Legal Action Network, GLAN, as an international legal advice organization, were quite helpful in terms of assisting us and our lawyers with respect to mounting the challenge, doing a lot of the groundwork and research and so on. So that cooperation with an international agency like GLAN, as well as our knowledge of the Escazú Agreement and knowledge of the system of justice enabled us to be able to and in that most important victory, which is going to have implications going forward in terms of how people can respond to threats to themselves, to the environment, to how things are being imposed. So that is my background, and that is how I got involved in terms of this particular situation. Okay, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, so thank you so much, John, for giving us the background into your involvement in this case. I'm just going to talk about a couple of points coming from the judgment, which John, in John's case, which came this February. So yeah, GLAN is an organization, and we work with different communities. And John is part of one of our grassroots community partners in Barbuda, which is in the Eastern Caribbean, and it's a small low-lying island. So this is the airport which the developers who came in after Hurricane Irma insisted upon for their private jets. And it is the airport that John and Jackie challenged the building of, because as you can see, it's cleared 500 acres of their forest on a very small island. And these forests were used for hunting and for fruit trees and other forms of food security. So John and Jackie challenged the permission that wasn't given to build this airport. So their case is a good example of how you can go after corporations or developers who are harming your environment, not directly by challenging them, but by actually challenging the government who helps them by giving them the green light to develop and to destroy the environment. So their case was a judicial review, which meant that they were challenging the government's decision-making process because the government's rules, the rules and the laws of Antigua and Barbuda weren't followed for this private jet runway. So in February, the Privy Council sitting in London decided in favour of John and Jackie with a really strong judgment, and they found that John and Jackie and anyone who cares about nature in their area or has any interest in nature or in birds or in animals or in just the environment and wants to protect it, the judgment was very clear that they have standing and broad standing to take challenges to access the courts. And these are some photos of John and Jackie outside the Privy Council in London. The judgment also, as John mentioned, invoked the Escazú Agreement. And this is the first time in a higher court in the Caribbean that this really important agreement was invoked, and it said that the court's findings, which were that John and Jackie do have standing and do have the right to challenge environmentally harmful developments on their island, even though they didn't live exactly where the airport was being built. That didn't matter. It didn't matter that they are not experts in airports or experts in X, Y, and Z. Anyone can take a case, and this is in line with the state's obligations because Antigua and Barbuda have ratified the Escazú Agreement. And the Escazú Agreement provides for a broad, active standing, which means that it should be very easy to access the courts in environmental cases and also to access environmental decision-making. And because their judgment came out in February, it meant that John and Jackie were able to travel to Chile for the Escazú Conference of the Parties. So here's some photos of them at that conference and John addressing that conference about the situation in Barbuda and their case, their precedent-setting case. So the case is also important in terms of rights to nature, as I mentioned. So this is a paragraph from the judgment, which basically says that whoever cares about nature is allowed to protect it through the courts. So some other points about the judgment is that it's another strong precedent for activists and grassroots people and anyone who wants to protect the environment, because what corporations and governments do is they try and distract from legal challenges by raising legal technicalities. So for example, in this case, what they tried to do is say that John and Jackie didn't have standing because they weren't experts or they weren't living exactly where the airport was being built. So they said they had no interest in the matter. And this was just a way of distracting from the real legal issues, which was the environment being destroyed and were proper procedures being followed. And this is often invoked in environmental cases, but this judgment is very helpful because it says that standing should not be an obstacle to taking these environmental cases. It's also an important judgment because it shows a watershed moment in Barbuda, again, in the fight by the local people against harmful developers. So the developers that swooped in to Barbuda after the hurricane, while everyone in Barbuda was being held on Antigua, they were all forcibly removed from their own home. The developers came in and started clearing the forest for this private jet runway. And they had insisted in their lease and their concessions with the government that this airport was absolutely necessary. And now, because of this case is very strategic because it's disrupted their plans. So now the developers are suing each other. And the second, apologies, this is in English, but I can just explain the second section of this slide is just a part of a case between the developers. They're suing each other, and one of the arguments in the case in the United States is that they have broken their contract because of the delays in the airport, and those delays are because of the case that John and Jackie took. So it just shows how a case against a government about a project can really disrupt investors and disrupt corporations and just halt those kinds of harmful developers. Another positive from the judgment is that it's very helpful for other environmental activists, especially in the Caribbean, but in the wider Latin American region because of the Escazú Agreement. So for example, the Grenada Land Actors are another grassroots group in Grenada in the Caribbean, and they are bringing a similar judicial review, a case against their government because of large, harmful mega tourist developments on their island. And John's case in the lower courts was actually already used against them. The government tried to say, oh, because of John Mussington's case in Barbuda, you also don't have standing to protect your environment. However, now that that has been overturned, the Grenada land actors will continue with their case with this judgment, knowing that they definitely have standing in their case. So I just wanted to talk quickly about some other cases that we are working with John and the Barbuda Land Rights and Resources Committee on. As John mentioned, Barbuda is a communally owned land, an island. However, the developers working in conjunction with the central government are really trying to dismantle that model of communal land ownership. So currently there's a domestic case which is being filed to challenge the government adjudicating or dividing up the island to sell off to these private investors and foreign investors. So that is being taken with a view to then filing a petition, if that doesn't work, to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, based on cases like the Saramacca case in Suriname and other communities in Latin America and the Caribbean who live in a similar way in terms of their connection with the land, whether it be indigenous groups or other Afro-descendant communities. We're also planning on perhaps submitting a communication to the Escazú Enforcement Committee, because even though the judgment found that, well, the judgment in John's case found that the government weren't living up to their obligations under the Escazú Agreement, so we might put in a complaint about that. And we're also considering engaging some UN human rights bodies like the UN Human Rights Committee in terms of the government's obligations to protect the Barbudan people from climate change, because these harmful developments are ripping out their mangroves and their wetlands and other ecosystems that have protected them historically from the impacts of extreme weather events. And finally, two other cases we're working on. This is George Jeffrey. He's a Barbudan fisherman and also a tour guide in the bird sanctuary in Barbuda. And there's a very large frigate bird sanctuary. It's the biggest in the Western Hemisphere. And a developer has come in and is building a private residence directly inside a national park and right next to the bird sanctuary. So George has filed a case, again, a judicial review, so not against the developer per se, but against the government for allowing the developer to do this. And another case is to do with Rosewood Hotels, which is a luxury hotel chain who are attempting to build a hotel on this land here. And the photo in the middle is a Barbudan landholder's small business, which the developer came in and just bulldozed because they are claiming that they have the right to that land. So that case is a trespass case. So putting it back on the developer to prove how they have access to that land in an attempt to secure communal land recognition in the courts of the communal land ownership in Barbuda. And yeah, just to finish, GLAN do some other work around the world in terms of environmental crimes and climate change. So, for example, this case is to do with the London Metals Exchange, and it's to do with metal coming from a mine, a very environmentally damaging mine in West Papua. A case was filed in London against the London Metals Exchange, who deal with this metal, and we say that it's the proceeds of crime. So we're trying to use the proceeds of crime as a framework to bring justice for communities in places like West Papua, for example. And also we've been involved in climate change litigation in Europe. But I don't want to go over time, so I might just finish there, and perhaps people might have questions for myself or John, and there's our emails if you want to get in touch. So thank you very much for having us.
Thanks a lot, Sarah and John. Before passing on to questions, there's a core aspect of the judicial review ruling, which I think is important to make sure that people picked up on, because it touches on what many people have been saying. One of the big problems is to do with the fact that court systems will demand very detailed environmental expertise, so that a community can say, oh, there's environmental damage, and you've got to prove it, you've got to prove it with loads of scientific reports. The kernel of the ruling here, if I understood it correctly, is that local experience and knowledge is acceptable as evidence. I don't need to know the scientific name of the tree that was chopped down. I don't need to know the exact percentage of wood chopped down. So can you confirm that's the case and just emphasize that part of the ruling, if that's okay?
Yeah, I can start, and John might want to jump in as well. I think, yeah, the fact that it was a judicial review meant that John and Jackie didn't necessarily need to bring in their own environmental reports. It was more so that their case was challenging the fact that permission was granted, despite the fact that the environmental impact assessment, so the report that was done, was never disclosed to the local people, which meant that the local people's knowledge of their island was never engaged with in that process. So it's a good way of challenging these developments, as you say, because of the evidence issue, because communities might not have resources to go and get their own independent environmental impact assessment, but they know that the fact that they weren't consulted, or the fact that these environmental impact assessments are done by scientists who work in collaboration with the developers and aren't independent, and basically say that there's not going to be much environmental impact. They know, because of their local knowledge, that's not true, and then they can challenge the decision-making process relying on those reports, which just aren't up to standard. I don't know, John, if you want to add. John, also, I was
Yes.
just add that he is actually an expert because he's a marine biologist, but the case very much, it noted his expertise in that, and he's worked on environmental impact assessments as well, but it also went further to say that that doesn't even matter. It could be anyone without any scientific background who can challenge. But yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, just to emphasize on that point in particular, because what the government side was actually saying was that they were trying to raise the bar so high that they considered even myself as a busybody, because I did not have expertise in airport construction and engineering. So they wanted to make that and set that as a precedence for you to be able to have standing to challenge. So what the Privy Council ruling essentially did was to say, you don't have, as an ordinary citizen, you don't need necessarily to be an expert in airport management, or you don't need to be an expert in forestry to have a concern about the environmental damage that is happening. And as an ordinary citizen, all you needed to have is just an interest in protecting whatever species, whatever forest, whatever situation that is going to impact you. And that is all you need to be able to mount that challenge. And that is the crucial importance of that decision. It makes it possible for ordinary citizens to be able to protect his or her interests. Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that clarification and emphasizing that. Vamos a pasar a una ronda de preguntas. Una aclaración. Este caso lo llevan a Londres, porque alguien me preguntó por qué en Londres.
London. Many countries in many Caribbean countries that were part of the British colonies, they still have a close relationship with this council in London that acts as a supreme court for them. So that's why this case was taken to London. So we would like to insist that we've heard. Some people have asked questions, but so I encourage all of you who haven't asked any questions, please intervene and ask your question. Who would like to go first? Do any of you have any questions? Okay, we are going to 2 or 3 questions from the audience. And first of all, good morning again, and thank you for sharing here. We call our the Minga of knowledge, the Minga of experiences. could also be, but I wanted to express that before the Constitution of 1991, back in 1983, I'm realizing that maybe multinational companies or transnational companies were the ones who sent some Japanese people to extract some samples from our territory. And now we are facing a problem, and yesterday we talked about it, and maybe today we can talk about that too, that illegal armed groups, they want to conduct mining activities because they know that in our area we have gold. So they're deceiving the indigenous communities, trying to buy some shafts, mine shafts, to be able to work, but without prior consultation with the indigenous authority. So I wanted to know maybe what can we do in our indigenous communities? How could we maybe not, we don't want to have those concessions that do not guarantee, because what I've heard vis-a-vis productive projects, and yesterday we talked a lot, about scholarships and things like that. But what happens if our land is destroyed, where we have lived, and all our ancestors, and we still live there, and we want our children and our future generations, we don't want to damage our land, because if it's true that by 2050 we will not have water, so the Colombian state organizations, international organizations, you could maybe help us not to grant those concessions, and not to, according to the Constitution, not to grant the permits to conduct this illegal mining. So that would be a way of supporting our territory, to stopping that from happening.
Good morning. Taking into account that the violation in this case, I'm going to be mentioning ruling 568 of 2017, when the court instructs that any dredging carried out in the Canal del Dique must be consulted previously. But at this point, a class action was filed, making the dredging operation stop until the consultation happened. But what we see with all this is that the government, with the Ministry of the Interior and the local authorities, were putting pressure on the communities. The prior consultation started, but they started the dredging operation. They forced the community to have the consultation, but the consultation was not finished yet, and the identification of the impacts had not been done, and the dredging went on. Because in this area, there are a lot of heavy materials. We see that this ruling is being breached, but they're using the community to continue with the dredging operation. In this case, what can we do? Taking into account that I wanted to ask about leveraging on the justice as to putting pressure on the companies. But how could we influence here so that there will be no more violations? No more violations of the constitutional law and the community rights of the population, our right to life, our right to a healthy environment. That was my question.
Yeah, John, do you want to share some of your experiences in terms of concessions being granted to foreign developers, and how on Barbuda you've managed to gather evidence and, you know, kind of name and shame those corporations through the Save Barbuda page, and maybe your experience in terms of consultations that haven't taken community input. Do you want to give some of your experience and tips on those points?
Okay, with regards to gathering information, we're basically fortunate in that we had pretty much good idea as to how the planning process should work and the need for environmental impact assessments and so on. So we were able to do the necessary background checks to see whether or not the law was being followed with regards to the necessary applications and permission granted and so on. And once we found out they were not, it was easier to then mount that legal challenge in terms of going through the court. The question, Sarah, you broke up a bit about community participation. What was that?
Yeah, I just think some of the questions that the audience posed was about the difficulty in these corporations coming in and not consulting with the community. So do you want to share the Barbudan experience of that?
Okay. On our laws, whenever there is a development planned, and especially if it involves an environmental impact assessment, what should have happened was that there was to be consultation, information sharing with the stakeholders, which is the Barbudan community. Well, in our experience, what we found was that evacuation order and to not consult with us as Barbudans. We were not getting any information whatsoever. We were just kept out of the process. We didn't know what was going on. And that situation was being exploited basically to push things, push ahead without any obstruction. So fortunately, those of us who were on the island realized what was happening, realized that it was a situation where we were deliberately kept out of the process. Information was kept from us. And so we pushed back in terms of forcing the situation of trying to get information. And we used social media especially to inform the community, not only on the ground here in Barbuda, but internationally, as to what actually was happening. And we use that process in terms of social awareness, social media awareness, to get our information out, to make people realize that there was something happening so that we can organize and resist what was being done to us. Okay? I hope that answers the question, Sarah.
Yeah, great, John. Can I just add? Sorry. Can I just add just
go ahead.
A part of the, so that John, because part of the question was also, and I just in case that he wanted to add anything more, there was reference to a very specific case, which is a ruling by the Constitutional Court in Colombia insisting that there should be a consultation process in regard to a canal project, to the draining, scooping out, deepening the canal. Basically, the work has started without that consultation happening. So the question is a bit, well, you've picked up, John, you've already mentioned how you've used social media, but just wanted to add that detail in case you have any other ideas of strategies, because I think what people are asking about is other strategies as well that you may have. The other participant was also talking very specifically about indigenous territories. How do you stop, how do you prevent these companies moving in when the communities don't want them there at all? Is there any other ideas that you can share?
Well, one of the tools we use essentially is that we do have a Freedom of Information Act. And so one of the strategies we used was to use the Freedom of Information Act to write to the necessary agencies to demand information. In some instances, we were not successful in getting a response, but then that was publicized. We made it public that, look, these are questions we asked. We went through the law in terms of freedom of information, and we're not getting any answers. And that helped to build awareness in the community. It helped to allow persons to be able to protest, to publicize the issue, essentially to demonstrate that things are happening that we are not approving of. We are being ignored. So we are making this thing public, not only on the ground here, but internationally. So the world can know that, look, something is happening here that is not correct, it's not following the law. And by doing so, those strategies in using the social media and building awareness, that actually helped in terms of allowing the developers, the investors to think twice before pushing through in terms of their actions.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, John. Does your interpretation button work just to know whether you'll be able to hear translation of the next round of questions?
No, actually, because I did press the button in terms of pressing for English translation, but I'm just not getting that.
Oh, right. Okay. We'll have to. Right. Fair enough. Let's try and do that. So, bueno, vamos a pasar a la siguiente ronda de preguntas. Si las preguntas sean corticas porque igual los tenemos que traducir para John, que no le funciona el sistema de traducción. Igual podemos empezar con Avery, que podría hacer su pregunta en inglés. ¿Y quién más quiere hacer alguna pregunta? ¿Usted? ¿Alguien más? Ok, pasamos primero a Avery.
Hi, Sarah and John. This is Avery Kelly from Corporate Accountability Lab in the United States. I'm really interested to hear about your work on proceeds of crime, and I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more to that. Maybe that would be a question for Sarah. One of the reasons I'm interested, as I'm sure happens a lot in Europe, but at least in the US context, is that our laws on corruption, for example, paying bribes to officials abroad or financing terrorist organizations, are often enforced more than our human rights protections. And so I think that once you have a judgment against a company for one of those financial crimes, it would be really interesting to then go the civil route to see if you can get damages for victims of those crimes. So curious to hear a little bit more about your work. Thanks.
Bueno, vengo de la parte norte de Puerto Wilches.
I come from the northern part of Puerto Wilches, a town in the geographic department of Santander. First of all, I want to thank you for this exchange of experiences that we're having today and that we've been having in these 3 days, because we're taking something that is fundamental for us to our territories and communities. So I want to thank you. Thanks to Cajar for inviting us for this space that is so important for our communities. The northern part, the Middle Magdalena Valley, Barranca, Puerto Wilches, I will focus on this area. The oil company of Colombia, Ecopetrol, has murdered several leaders in the territory. But
Porque no me acuerdo todos los detalles, pero me disculpa, ¿no? So basically, the speaker is talking, comes from the Puerto Wilches area of Santander. This is more or less central Colombia. It's an area with lots of oil interests, particularly coordinated by Ecopetrol, which is the state oil company. And the speaker was talking about how there are paramilitary groups still operating in that area. And these groups have been killing peasant farmer activists and leaders in the area over the recent times, so recent years. There was a fisherman activist killed about a week ago, and the area has a mixture. Shell is moving into the area. There's been environmental destruction of wetlands, areas where there were jaguar and other sorts of flora and fauna are in the process of being destroyed. So the question comes down to how can get support, solidarity to find out who's behind all these economic interests that are destroying our lands. He added as well, there's also African palm interests in the area. So I think it's a call out for getting support. So, Susie, algo más que puedo decir, más o menos. So I don't know if you've got any comments or ideas also about linking up. Part of the purpose of this forum is for people to make links as well between different organizations and activists. So anyway, perhaps you can comment and see what reactions you have. We've got.
I can quickly answer the question from the colleague from the US. I actually didn't catch the start of it, but I think it was a question about our work. Yeah, in terms of what we're trying to do at GLAN is we're trying to use the very robust legal systems in the global north, so specifically the UK and the EU in terms of money laundering and proceeds of crime, which, as I think you mentioned, are often used in contexts outside of environmental crime, and they're quite strong pieces of legislation, but they're not generally applied to contexts outside of Europe, let's say. So what we're doing in that case that I mentioned in terms of the mine in West Papua, we're also trying to develop a case with Cahar in Colombia in terms of coal coming from the Cerrejón mine, which has been sold in Ireland, where I am. And we have other cases, for example, cotton coming from the Uyghur region of China, where it's made with forced labor. These goods are all entering the markets, whether it's the stock market or just the market for free circulation within Europe. Goods that have either been made with forced labor or flow directly from environmental crimes. So we're trying to apply the legislation in the UK and in the EU to make courts make judgments finding these products coming from, for example, Colombia, to be the proceeds of crime. And then the next step would be to ask are the regulatory bodies, for example, in Ireland, to make findings that because there has been the importation of proceeds of criminal conduct, that those companies who have been importing them should give their profits back to the communities which has suffered. So that's the model that we are working on. And as I said, we have a number of cases trying to apply that. And yeah, in terms of corruption, I guess it's just quite difficult. For example, in Barbuda, the government there is quite corrupt in terms of its links to foreign corporations, but it's just quite difficult to prove. So we're working on different strategies there. But yeah, just to sum up, that's our model for trying to use proceeds of criminal conduct in terms of environmental crimes in the global south by using the courts in the global north where these products are flowing into. And I also might just, before I pass to John, just to say, yeah, very sorry to hear everything that's happening to your communities. It just sounds very, very scary, and offering all the solidarity that we can from GLAN. Maybe John can explain a bit about the Escazú action plan for human rights defenders. I know the Escazú Agreement it hasn't been fully ratified in Colombia, but maybe that's one strategy of advocacy to get that agreement passed in Colombian law, because there is this new action plan for human rights defenders, which could help in terms of solidarity with other activists in the region under the umbrella of the Escazú Agreement. So, John, do you want to add to that?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. I listened to the speaker, and really I'm horrified in terms of what your people have to go through in terms of murders of human rights defenders, murders of ordinary fishermen, and so on. That's really horrible. It is something that I notice is really happening to indigenous people and land defenders in Central America. And the Escazú Agreement, fortunately, this last conference we had, there are two main things that came on stream. One is to have that compliance committee where they can receive complaints directly from communities, and the Secretariat is duty bound to provide the resources to investigate those complaints. They have to do it. The other aspect of the Escazú that came out strongly, and especially among the Latin American countries, precisely for the reasons which were described there, the murders of land defenders and so on. The other thing is the action plan for human rights defenders. That is a specific plan to try to address and prevent those sorts of atrocities that are happening to people, people who may be powerless, who may not have access to justice and so on, just to try to stop that sort of thing from happening. So definitely the Escazú Agreement is something that can be used. The other very critical thing is that a lot of these things happen when are allowed to pass when generally people don't know what is going on. So information, getting out information, the awareness of these atrocities taking place, that definitely can play a role, especially the companies that are involved, essentially telling the story as, okay, the palm oil people and the other extractors, the beneficiaries, tell the story of what is happening on the ground to real people to facilitate that sort of thing happening. So that's a very important tool, awareness, making a lot of noise, getting the word out. That I think is a good defense in terms of your situation. Okay.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah and John. I think we have to pass on to the next speaker, but I'll just give a quick chance to see if there's anybody else that wants to raise a question to you quickly. ¿Hay alguien más que quiera decir una pregunta más o pasemos a la próxima ponencia?
Old conflict has certain characteristics in the country where more than, there are many assassinated leaders. It doesn't mean that we cannot continue with our fight. So we invite you, John, for us to know about your experience deeply in the future, because one of the problems that we face is the lack of funds to do research. And that's a big advantage that the multinationals and transnationals have. They have important economic resources in millions for communications plans that are very relevant in the country and all the authorities. While on the other hand, the communities are very much left alone or sometimes accompanied by very powerful organizations. But for a country in such difficulties, it is impossible for the organizations that accompany us can reach out to solving all the problems.
Definitely. Thank you for that invitation. And fortunately, let me tell you something. We are, in fact, in contact with Providencia Island, the Rizal people on New Providencia, through a network which we have formed over the past 3-4 years. It's called Stronger Caribbean Together. And we do have representatives in that network from Providencia in Colombia. And specifically with respect to what is happening there to the Rizal people after the storm, Hurricane Ayo, I think it was, they experienced the very same thing we were going through. So it's very important that these networks are there. And I would refer you to strongercaribbeantogether.org. That websites provide information on the partners which we do have throughout the region, exactly for that purpose, for sharing ideas, because we realize Stronger Caribbean Together, when we work together, sharing information, understanding the playbook, which is being used by these extractors and some same corporations we're dealing it, and that really helps in terms of empowerment. So I refer you to that Stronger Caribbean Together, and definitely, yes, I will be willing to network with persons there in terms of sharing information. So thank you.
Brilliant, John. If you've got any other information, you've got our emails to if you pass them on, we can also share some of that information with the people here. So once again, thank you very much for your time and for your input. As I say, you're welcome to stay and listen, and no obligation if you want, but we're very grateful for the fact you've made the effort to give us this great presentations. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Estamos.